low vision, or have another print disability which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Corrine, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the August 25th, 2026 issue of the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. As always, thank you for joining us today. The highlights under Business and Finance are: California canceled a planned meeting with Paramount's chief executive where the parties were expected to discuss settling a lawsuit blocking the company's acquisition of Warner Brothers Discovery. Sliding shares of chip makers and intensifying geopolitical tension weighed on tech-heavy U.S. stock indexes, helping depress the S&P 500 and NASDAQ by 0.3% and 0.8% respectively. The Dow rose 0.3%. 2 months after China-owned electric vehicle maker Polestar was forced to leave the U.S. market, the company told its American dealers that it was blindsided by the decision. The NHTSA expanded its investigation into GM's electronic braking system after receiving several complaints. SoftBank plans to issue a record volume of retail bonds to partly fund its expanding artificial intelligence investments. Eli Lilly launched its Foundayo weight loss pill in the UK, making the country the first in Europe to offer the oral treatment. PDD, the Chinese owner of bargain shopping app Temu, reported better than expected profit for the second quarter. The FTC reached a settlement with Zillow and Redfin, resolving a claim that the companies had collaborated to reduce market competition. YMTC, China's flagship memory chip maker, filed for an IPO in Shanghai to raise $4.9 billion, potentially leading to a boost in the company's output. Now for the key articles under the Worldwide section. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said the U.S. is launching a new campaign to isolate Iran, warning of consequences for nations and companies that do business with the regime. The trackers whose job it is to count the world's oil ships see much less volume passing through the Strait of Hormuz than that publicized by the Trump administration. Trump said the U.S. would impose 50% tariffs on automobiles and parts from Canada starting in January, escalating a tit-for-tat trade conflict that erupted days ago. The Supreme Court removed a legal obstacle that had stopped the president from imposing new restrictions on mail-in voting ahead of the midterm elections in November. The U.S. scrapped a large-scale, ambitious exercise with South Korea scheduled for next month, the latest American pullback in Asia amid the war in Iran. The Trump administration proposed a revised six-figure fee for H-IB visas that would apply to most new applicants, replacing a plan to charge $100,000 for the document that courts struck down. The UK and France are sending classified technology to Kyiv to allow it to make an Anglo-French cruise missile that it can field in the war with Russia. Taiwan prosecutors charged 9 people, including former employees of NVIDIA and Supermicro, with aiding the shipment of advanced AI servers to China. A local business coalition sued New York City and Mayor Zoran Mandani over the mayor's plan to open 5 government-owned grocery stores around the city. The picture on today's front page shows Scott Bessent standing before a podium where there appears to be a news conference, and in the background are multiple flags of the United States. And that caption reads, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent on Monday said the U.S. would start a new campaign of economic measures against Iran and countries doing business with the regime. Top Iranian officials said the new U.S. strategy would be ineffective. The article, U.S. launches new wave of sanctions against Iran, by Brian Schwartz, Lawrence Norman, and Alexander Ward, Washington. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said on Monday the U.S. is launching a new campaign to isolate the Iranian regime, warning that countries and companies that do business with Tehran will face the wrath of the Trump administration. Let there be no ambiguity as to the position of the United States, and economic engagement of any kind with this murderous regime will expose those responsible to the full reach of American power, Bessent said during a news conference. As part of the new effort, which he called Operation Economic Outcast, Bessent said his department has mapped every node, every facilitator, and every network that Iran has used to smuggle oil and evade sanctions. He said the U.S. was sanctioning more than 60 entities, individuals, and vessels across the world that enable the regime to procure nuclear and missile technology, earn revenue from oil, and carry out cyber operations. The U.S. has had sanctions on Iran for years, but the Trump administration's recent naval blockade against Iranian ports and commerce is adding pressure to Tehran's weak economy, with Iran's currency recently dropping to a record low against the dollar. President Trump said on social media Monday that Iran is completely collapsing. Top Iranian officials said the new effort would be ineffective. Bessent didn't outline any specific steps the U.S. would take against individual countries, including China, a major buyer of Iran's oil. He said the U.S. privately defined timelines for countries to comply, but then said, I'm not going to set timelines, but we do not have infinite patience here. After the news conference, the Treasury Department announced that secondary sanctions could apply to countries and entities that do business in 5 sectors: digital assets, technology, gold, aviation, and shipping. Treasury officials also suspended several general licenses for remittance payments and provided more sanctions risk guidance to those who comply with Iran's demands in the Strait of Hormuz. Last week, Besson said the aim of the new policy would be to create the conditions for regime collapse. The ambiguity in Monday's announcement leaves open the question of whether the campaign will achieve his goal of executing the largest ever economic isolation campaign. Besson did give a few specific examples of action the U.S. will take. He said the U.S. will push other countries to shutter foreign branches of Bank Melli, Iran's state-owned biggest bank, which has branches in several European countries. He said there would be an announcement this week of sanctions against a financial institution, as well as new steps to restrict aviation and shipping links with Iran and prevent trade in gold and digital currencies. Trump, he said, is making phone calls to world leaders to request they stop doing business with Iran. The announcement comes as the U.S. has struggled to bring the war with Iran to an end. The U.S. and Iran have so far failed to reach an agreement to fully reopen the Strait of Hormuz and force Tehran to curb its nuclear ambitions. Other articles from the front page follow. Trump escalates threats against Canada. Tariffs on autos and parts are the latest in the growing trade battle between neighbors. By Gavin Bade, Amanda Coletta, and Paul Vieira. President Trump said the U.S. would impose 50% tariffs on automobiles and parts from Canada starting in January, the latest escalation in a tit-for-tat trade conflict that erupted over the weekend. On January 1st, 2027, tariffs on all cars, trucks, both large and small, automotive parts, and steel, will be increased to 50%, Trump wrote Monday on Truth Social. U.S. tariffs on Canadian automobiles now stand at 25%, with discounts for the U.S. content in cars, while steel tariffs are at 50%. The threat came after Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada said his government would respond to a separate set of Trump's tariffs with levies on U.S. products. Trump imposed those new tariffs, effective on about 5% of Canadian exports to the U.S., early on Saturday, after last-minute talks fell apart. Trump's latest move heightens the risk the U.S. and Canada could descend into all-out economic conflict. After talks collapsed, Carney said that his country would respond to Trump's actions and that he would rather have no economic deal with the U.S. than one he thought was bad for Canadian businesses or gave away its sovereignty. The new levies also cast further doubt over the future of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the trilateral deal that replaced NAFTA. Carney said on Monday it wasn't surprising that Trump would take some form of reprisal. Canada learned during the negotiations that the U.S. wants to destroy our major industry, including our auto industry, he said in Quebec, with negotiating terms that were not fair. Whether the higher automotive tariffs can be averted is unclear. After talks unraveled, U.S. officials said they had no plans to meet with their Canadian counterparts and would instead proceed with implementing the previously announced tariffs on a long list of goods ranging from wine and cement to hockey sticks. Vice President J.D. Vance, speaking in Maine on Monday, said the U.S. could still make a deal if Canada reduces levies on U.S. goods. I think that we need to send a message loud and clear to the Prime Minister of Canada, Vance said. Stop taking advantage of America. It's over. In Washington, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said Trump would like Canada to come to the table and negotiate in good faith. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Oil math doesn't add up in Hormuz by Georgie Kenchef, Rebecca Feng, and Summer Saeed, Dubai. The Trump administration says large volumes of oil are slipping through the Strait of Hormuz. The trackers, whose job it is to count the world's oil shipments, see much less. Energy Secretary Chris Wright said last week the U.S. military had helped ship over 15 million barrels of crude and oil products out of the waterway last week. He put the average oil exports through the strait over a 7-day period at more than 8 million barrels a day. Earlier this month, Wright said the 7-day average stood at around 9 million barrels a day. The count from commercial ship trackers tells a different story, with estimates ranging from 2 million to 6 million barrels a day. Industry figures on the amount of crude oil and oil products being loaded onto ships in the Persian Gulf and delivered to buyers don't corroborate the U.S. claims. The discrepancy matters in terms of setting expectations for oil traders and for judging who is winning the economic war of attrition that Washington and Tehran are fighting, with oil as a key weapon. There are lots of reasons the numbers can diverge. Many ships are crossing the strait at night with their transponders off, making them hard to track by radio signal or satellite imagery. Big tankers can carry 2 million barrels apiece, so missing 1 or 2 can make all the difference. Measurement periods also make a difference, as do assumptions about how full ships are when they cross. Wright has said private data firms are undercounting ships that move covertly through the waterway. Still, a persistent gap remains between Washington's estimates and what the market can verify. With the war knocking out large volumes of supply, oil prices and the global economy are quite sensitive to how much crude might come to market. How the president got the DOJ off Live Nation's back. Antitrust case settled after White House call, avoiding breakup. By Rebecca Ballhaus, Joe Palazzolo, Dana Mattioli, Josh Dawsey, and Dave Michaels. The Justice Department was preparing to wage a legal battle more than a decade in the making against the world's largest concert promoter. Then President Trump called. Settle it, the president told a senior DOJ official. The official later told associates. The intervention was bizarre. The antitrust trial against Live Nation, which also owns Ticketmaster, a combination that draws relentless consumer criticism, was set to begin March 2nd, just days away. Trump had vowed to crack down on the industry just a year earlier when he signed an executive order targeting ticket scalping and exploitative pricing. DOJ officials and the company had spent months exchanging settlement proposals but had little to show for it, and some in the government had been pushing to break up the giant. White House involvement in law enforcement matters, once taboo, is a regular feature of Trump's second term. But many DOJ officials regarded the political interference in the Live Nation case as extreme, even for an administration in which the president has openly pressured law enforcement officials to pursue perceived enemies and pardon allies. Weeks before Trump's call, Live Nation told DOJ officials that the company had brought in a fresh set of lawyers for settlement talks. They were from Sullivan and Cromwell, the New York-based firm that represents Trump in his personal legal troubles. DOJ officials also learned that Boris Epstein, Trump's private legal coordinator, had taken a keen interest in resolving the case, according to people familiar with the matter. The officials didn't know whether he was working for Trump or Live Nation or both. After months of unproductive negotiations, Live Nation saw its fortunes change in roughly the span of a week. On Friday, February 27th, Live Nation CEO Michael Rapino met with Trump in the Oval Office. Trump had called the meeting to discuss how to improve bookings at the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, according to people familiar with the conversation. He also wanted to know why the company hadn't reached a deal over its lawsuit, the people said. The president's directive to settle the case would follow the meeting. When asked about the role of the White House in the Live Nation settlement at his July confirmation hearing for Attorney General, Todd Blanche replied, "I wasn't directly part of the discussions, so I can't speak to that. But I'm most certainly not saying they were not part of it." CEOs want AI agents to read your messages, by Lindsay Ellis and Allison Pohl. Lobbing a private Slack direct message to a colleague is second nature to many in the workplace. To brainstorm, plot strategy, or even just vent. Artificial intelligence creep is changing all that. Executives are urging their staff to send messages in public Slack channels, open to anyone in the office to see, rather than privately pinging colleagues. They want AI agents crawling through messages to have unfettered access to every update on products, earnings, and strategic initiatives. As bots are unleashed throughout workplaces to analyze information, make recommendations, pull together slide decks, or write code, the thinking goes those AI agents should know the very latest information available. After all, information is power. And while humans control most of it, bots are faster at gobbling it up and sifting through it. Much of the focus on AI's impact on work has highlighted jobs, how corporate ladders will be structured, and how staff might be reduced. Within companies, however, many leaders are examining how AI will change internal norms to deepen the technology's impact. Communication is one of them. Data on what people are writing and how they are working are becoming extremely valuable to companies. Leaving the front page, Polestar says White House strung it along before ban, by Christopher Otts. 2 months after Chinese-owned electric vehicle maker Polestar was forced to exit the U.S. market, the company is telling its American dealers that it was blindsided. Polestar said in an August 18th letter to dealers, seen by the Wall Street Journal, that it still doesn't have an explanation for why it must cease U.S. sales, while Volvo Cars, a corporate cousin that sells a nearly identical car, was allowed to remain. The decision was issued June 24th by the U.S. Commerce Department as part of a wider crackdown on Chinese vehicle technology. The Trump administration is implementing a new rule aimed at preventing China from spying on Americans via connected vehicle technology. Polestar is the first automaker to be effectively blocked from the U.S. under the rule, which originated during the Biden administration. Polestar also said the Commerce Department had signaled it would be allowed to stay in the U.S., just like its corporate cousin, Volvo Cars. Polestar and Volvo share the same Chinese majority owner, Zhejiang Geely Holding Group, and two of their models are built on the same production line in South Carolina with nearly identical hardware and the same software inside. In essence, we are currently focusing on getting the attention of the Commerce Department to obtain the requested information and to understand the underlying basis for the denial. Peter Wexler, Polestar's U.S. head of product, retail network, and government affairs, said in the letter. Ruling on mail-in voting is a win for Trump, by James Rameser, Louise Ravnovsky. Washington. The Supreme Court removed a legal obstacle that had stopped President Trump from imposing new restrictions on mail-in voting ahead of the midterm elections in November. The court, over the dissent of 3 liberal justices, ruled that a trial judge was wrong to block the administration from implementing key provisions of a March executive order from Trump on mail ballots. That order called for the federal government to draw up lists of eligible voters and suggested that the U.S. Postal Service should refuse to deliver mail ballots in states that don't comply with new rules. In an unsigned 10-page opinion, the court's conservative majority said there were procedural problems with a lawsuit brought by a group of roughly 24 Democratic-run states. The court said the states' legal challenge was premature and that they didn't have legal standing to contest parts of Trump's executive order. The latest decision is unlikely to be the final word on the matter. Kyiv to get classified military technology. UK, France will send missile know-how, but cash crunch hurts weapons production. By Alistair MacDonald. The UK and France are sending classified technology to Kyiv to allow it to make an Anglo-French cruise missile, part of a growing trend of Western countries helping Ukraine to build the weapons it needs to fight Russia's invasion. The UK said Monday it will allow defense firm MBDA to share with Ukraine proprietary information on the British-made parts for the long-range Anglo-French cruise missile that Downing Street said Kyiv is looking to make domestically. The Ukrainian government didn't respond to a request for comment. The French call the weapon Scalp, while in the UK it is known as the Storm Shadow. French President Emmanuel Macron in July gave permission for Ukraine to make a package of French weapons, including the Scalp and Aster interceptor missiles that are used in Europe's equivalent of the Patriot. After Russia invaded in February 2022, Ukraine was reliant on transfers of weapons from Western allies. As the war has dragged on, Kyiv expanded its defense technology sector, capitalizing on its drone expertise. But Ukraine's arsenal still has large gaps, including in missile defense, and the country remains dependent on European funding to continue fighting. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the editorial page, Trump unleashes Besant on Iran. The president redoubles the economic pressure amid signs it's working. On Monday, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced Operation Economic Outcast against Iran and its enablers, even comparing the action to D-Day. Our objective is to sever every economic lifeline that sustains this tyrannical regime until Tehran stands alone, he said. President Trump is working the phones, and every country has a defined timeline to shut down activities we have identified, Mr. Bessent said. If they do not take action, we will do so unilaterally. He declined to lay out the timelines, leaving Mr. Trump room to delay, but he said to expect a major announcement of a financial institution being sanctioned by the end of this week. The D-Day analogy may be grandiose, but President Trump has waited nearly 6 months to take this economic step. Early in the war, the U.S. even encouraged Iranian oil exports. We've come a long way. Last week, Iran's central bank governor admitted the U.S. blockade of Iran's ports has driven the regime's oil exports to zero. The United Arab Emirates also announced a halt to all trade with Iran. Mr. Bessent said that was not a coincidence. On Sunday, Iran's currency plummeted past 2 million to the dollar, a new record. That's down from 1.4 million to start the year, 750,000 in 2024, and 70,000 when Mr. Trump quit the Iran nuclear deal in 2018. Inflation is raging, and the regime is preparing to slash fuel subsidies, always politically combustible. Iranian politicians are suddenly worried. On Friday, President Mossad Pezeshkian urged, the war must come to an end at some point, and acknowledged Iran's economic shortages. On Thursday, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, Iran's parliamentary speaker and top negotiator, said, no matter how much military power we have, if people are hungry and we don't have financial circulation, economic growth, and domestic production, we will not endure. This is the stuff regime fissures are made of. As if to underscore the point, the electricity went out as the Parliament's Energy Committee met Monday to discuss Iran's power outages. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, likely takes a harder line, though it also hurts for lack of oil revenue. Worse, it may be losing control of the Strait of Hormuz as the U.S. escorts increasing quantities of oil. With the price of oil still below $100, the U.S. may be able to maintain its blockade longer than Iran's regime can bear. The question, as always, is whether the Trump administration will stick to its plans. Mr. Bessent said the economic campaign will not end until this regime stands alone, and the preemptive action by the UAE is a good sign. But even halting direct trade leaves intact Dubai's Iran sanctions evasion network, whose goal is to disguise any trading with Iran. Mr. Bessent's reference to Emirati exchange houses implies he knows this. Iran's enablers purchase and transport its petroleum. They facilitate the flow of its finances through exchange houses and free trade zones, he said. They welcome Iran's flights and maintain registries on its behalf. They turn a blind eye to seaborne fuel transfers and overland transits. They condone illicit use of their banks. His remarks suggest Treasury has identified the regime's key cash spigots, maneuvers, and enablers. The latter includes the UAE, Iraq, Turkey, Malaysia, Qatar, Pakistan, and above all, China. While purchases of Iranian oil by Chinese teapot refineries are now thwarted by the U.S. blockade, the buyers remain willing. Is the U.S. willing to climb the sanctions ladder, proceeding from those small refineries to target the Chinese state-owned banks and other institutions that sustain them? Treasury warned as much in April, but the Trump administration hasn't followed through. Now is its test. Asked Monday about breaking a trade truce with China, Mr. Bessent said, if they facilitate transactions and are part of the ecosystem that turns Iranian oil into money, into repression, they will be targeted. Yet when asked why he hadn't imposed major sanctions today and merely warned of them, Mr. Bessent replied, why would I want to blow up the global financial system? If that's what he thinks pressing China on Iranian oil purchases would do, Beijing may call his bluff. Mr. Trump has belatedly found a pressure strategy with Iran that may give him the upper hand. But the IRGC is unlikely to give up its financing networks without a fight. Will Mr. Trump stick to this strategy when Iran next fires on Gulf energy and whispers a soothing word to mediators from Pakistan and Qatar? Trump to Ford Motor, drop dead. A 50% tariff on autos from Canada would punish U.S. companies. There he goes again. President Trump on Monday raged against Canada on the social media heath, threatening it with 50% tariffs on autos and auto parts. What does he have against U.S. car makers? Mr. Trump is angry that Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney over the weekend vowed to retaliate dollar for dollar against his latest tariff barrage. Canada has been ripping off the United States of America for years, Mr. Trump wrote. On January 1st, 2027, tariffs on all cars, trucks, both large and small, automotive parts, and steel will be increased to 50%. The January 1st date suggests that Mr. Trump probably isn't serious. No doubt he understands that a 50% tariff would hurt U.S. automakers more than it would Canada. Ford Motor CEO Jim Farley last year warned that Mr. Trump's 25% emergency tariffs on Canada and Mexico would blow a hole in the U.S. auto industry, and he was right. Thus, the administration exempt autos and other goods covered by the United States-Mexico-Canada trade agreement from his emergency tariffs. Mr. Trump's 25% national security tariffs on autos and parts also include carve-outs for U.S.-made parts and other emollients for U.S. automakers with cross-border supply chains with Canada and Mexico. Canada exports about $50.4 billion in vehicles and parts to the U.S. each year, notably to Michigan, $22.1 billion, and Texas, $14.8 billion. Mr. Trump's 50% tariff would amount to a $25 billion tax on U.S. automakers, their suppliers, and customers, namely buyers of large pickups assembled in Canada. Mr. Trump claimed, "We don't need Canada, they need us." Ontario Premier Doug Ford corrected him, noting that Canada sends electricity to the U.S. that keep the lights on, as well as nickel for defense and uranium for nuclear power plants. What would they do without the high-grade nickel that we ship down to the U.S.? Mr. Ford mused. Regardless of whether the president walks back from his tariff cliff, his whipsawing threats add uncertainty that chills investment. I've basically gotten a PhD over the last year in tariffs because I feel like that's my sole job. Mary Buck-Geiser, CEO of Michigan-based auto parts supplier Lucerne International, told a local radio station. She added, "Everybody is paralyzed with fear right now because of these changing regulatory tides, because of the changing tariffs, and it's impossible to make good plans and solid plans and be able to move forward and make those investments comfortably." As is so often the case, Mr. Trump on trade is his own worst enemy. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the opinion pages, America faces the constraints of democracy. Domestic spending crowded out defense, and the world is more dangerous as a result. By Walter Russell Mead. We don't want to fight, but by jingo, if we do, we've got the ships, we've got the men, we've got the money too. That was the refrain to a music hall hit from the 1870s. It warned Russia not to tangle with the British lion and expressed Imperial Britain's self-confidence at the height of its power. The British haven't had that swagger in a long time. As the unholy alliance of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea escalates, its strategic confrontation with the U.S., shortages of missiles and ships are beginning to make Americans worry about the limits of our military power. Worse, financial markets fret that with the national debt passing $40 trillion and interest rates close to a 20-year highs, Uncle Sam might just be maxing out his last credit card. We are moving from the post-Cold War era of living as if American power was largely unlimited and unconstrained to one in which we have less freedom to choose our responses and threats grow more challenging. Domestically, we are undergoing a similar shift from an era when federal spending was largely unfettered, to a new age in which, thanks to inflation and higher interest rates, the cost of excessive spending become unbearably high. None of it was unpredictable. The consequences are dire. Kiev is in flames because politicians and military planners fooled themselves into believing we could safely squeeze defense spending and avoid the hard problems of Pentagon reform, even as the geopolitical challenges intensified. In prosecuting the war with Iran, American strategists faced the consequences of these same decisions in our inability to protect our own bases, much less the military assets and cities of our allies. As the last American aircraft carrier leaves the Western Pacific, the empty storage facilities where defensive missiles once waited raised doubts about America's ability to fulfill treaty commitments to South Korea and Japan. A new and darker era seems to be opening across the Pacific. The economic news is hardly more reassuring, and the coming clash between the urgent need to accelerate defense spending dramatically and the chronic hunger of large domestic constituencies for federal largesse could define an era of American politics. Not since the earliest days of the Cold War have Americans had to live in a world of real limits, security threats that we lacked the weapons or the troops to counter right away, or urgent domestic priorities that we lacked the resources to address. This is the new normal, and for a while at least, we are going to have to get used to it. It isn't the end of the world. America's greatest Cold War historian, John Lewis Gaddis, makes the point that presidents like Dwight Eisenhower, who believed that America's unlimited resources needed to be carefully husbanded, often proved to be wiser and more effective strategists than those like Lyndon B. Johnson, who thought we had the money and the power to accomplish virtually anything we could think of. President Trump's many critics and political enemies would like to put all blame for the current state of affairs on his shoulders, and certainly he and his team have made decisions, sometimes rashly, that have exacerbated the underlying problems. But lectures on prudence and virtue have a hollow ring when they come from those who neglected the urgent problems of our defense industrial base, temporized with our opponents, underfunded national defense, and fecklessly accelerated the unsustainable course of federal spending. For now, the nation faces two tasks. First, the administration must find a way to get the most vital jobs done, even if it lacks all the tools one would want for the task. Mr. Trump's willingness to discard convention and business as usual can be an asset, though it's an unforgiving environment and undisciplined shenanigans as opposed to creative innovation will carry heavy cost. Second, the public needs to wake up and demand better of our elected politicians. It's easy to criticize political elites for their generational failures of strategic and fiscal policy that got us into this mess, but those failures were popular. Too many Americans wanted to hear that we could have a peaceful and democratic world without the costly inconvenience of maintaining an adequate defense industrial base, the trouble of making the Pentagon efficient, and the risks and cost of countering China's record-breaking military buildup. Too many more of us wanted to hear that we could indefinitely afford the unlimited expansion of poorly designed entitlement programs and cover our ever-escalating deficits with borrowed cash. Democracy, H.L. Mencken wrote, is the theory that the common people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard. We are getting it good and hard now. The question is whether we can wise up fast enough to avoid the worst. El Sayed abandons the middle. Republican Mike Rogers has a chance to win Democratic votes in Michigan. By William McGurn. The election is coming. The election is coming. Just as Paul Revere warned colonists about the approach of the British, Mike Rogers is trying to rouse Michiganders to action by saying the election begins not in November, but on September 24th, when early voting begins. Election Day is November 3rd, just under 6 weeks later. Mr. Rogers, the Republican candidate for Senate, is squaring off against Democrat Abdul El Sayed, a 41-year-old Rhodes Scholar and doctor who never practiced medicine. This tight race will determine not only who Michigan sends to Washington, but possibly who controls the Senate. One August poll shows Mr. El Sayed with an edge, though others show Mr. Rogers ahead. This is a battle between common sense ideas and radical extremist policies peddled by a con man that are out of place in our society, Mr. Rogers says. Mr. Rogers hopes his conservative record and moderate demeanor attract not only Republicans, but disaffected Democrats too. Mr. El Sayed won his primary by 1 point, and a majority of Democrats voted against him. Mr. Rogers' background should help. He is a former Army lieutenant who joined the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He then entered Michigan politics, serving 2 terms as a state senator and 7 terms in the House, where he rose to become Intelligence Committee chairman. In 2024, when Mr. Rogers ran for Michigan's other Senate seat, he lost by only 19,000 votes, or less than half a percentage point. This time the GOP has its usual issues, mostly involving President Trump. But if Mr. Rogers can hold on to his base while attracting Democrats who think their party has gone too left, he will prevail. Already the Muslim card is being played for and against Mr. El Sayed. This weekend, the Washington Post carried this headline: El Sayed's win triggered wave of anti-Muslim rhetoric online. Post analysis shows. The subhead explained that after Mr. El Sayed became the Democratic nominee, conservative commentary about him shifted focus from socialism to his Muslim identity. In Michigan, home to about 240,000 Muslims, these are fighting words. Thus the effort to cast Mr. Rogers as a bigot. Earlier in the month, Mr. Rogers released a video of himself tooling around Michigan in a cherry red vintage Ford pickup truck. A staffer for the El Sayed campaign said on X, Mike Rogers' campaign has the aesthetics of a 1960s white flight suburb and a KKK cross burning. Nolan Finley, a columnist for the Detroit News, likens the crack to Hillary Clinton's dismissing Trump voters as a basket of deplorables. Mr. Finley points out that the Ford F-150, which debuted in 1975, is the nation's best-selling truck line and is the symbol of working America, making the staffer's comment not a smart thing to say in Motor City. Mr. Finley's larger point is that Mr. El Sayed isn't even trying to appeal to the middle. Ask Eric Bronstein, a businessman who is circulating a letter by Michigan Jews against extremism. Many of us have been fiercely supportive of Democratic candidates and principles, it reads. All of us have felt threatened and alienated by the politics and allies embraced by Abdul El Sayed, which has included demonization of Jews, equivocation on terrorism, exclusion of Jewish Americans from public life, and expression of implacable hatred of the world's only Jewish nation. Mr. Rogers is trying to take advantage of the situation with a special effort to court Jewish voters. He's firmly pro-Israel, but he's also said the American Israel Public Affairs Committee should stay out of the race. AIPAC spent $32 million in the Democratic primary in an unsuccessful effort to defeat Mr. El Sayed, and that has become an issue. Mr. El Sayed has denounced AIPAC and Israel, but he also claims he wants only equal rights for Muslims. He says his commitment to Jewish safety is the same commitment that I have to the safety of my own daughters. But Mr. El Sayed calls Israel bloodthirsty, accuses it of apartheid and genocide, and likens American attempts to bar Sharia or Islamic law to white supremacy. Where Mr. El Sayed is doubling down, Mr. Rogers is reaching out. Time is money in Michigan, and early votes are money in the bank, he says. People forget or get busy. A sudden trip pops up. There's bad weather on Election Day. I need my voters to defeat Abdul by putting the vote in the bank as soon as the polls open in September. The Pepper and Salt cartoon today shows a husband and wife out hiking, and they come to a fork in the road. One is clear and the other has a lot of debris on it. And he says, but if we take the road more traveled, maybe we'll find a place to get a coffee. You've been listening to the August 25th Wall Street Journal, read by Corrine. Thank you for listening.
You're listening to the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Volunteer radio readers broadcast daily reading